Welcome to TLDR for Character Balance in Path of Exile, Lake of Kalandra, Part 2. In this video, I'm going to be going over some of the other changes, with a focus on melding of the flesh, flasks, and a couple other things at the end. If you want to watch Part 1, that'll be in the card right now, along with the full livestream where I go over all my thoughts in a little bit more detail. But I know that a nearly 2-hour livestream isn't for everyone, so I wanted to make these more bite-sized and quite a bit more digestible. So let's dive into it, starting with the change to flasks, because this has gotten a lot of attention, and there seems to be a lot of really bad takes at best, blatant misinformation at worst, in regards to what this actually means. The line of flask modifiers grant flask charges when you're hit by an enemy makes it too easy to keep your flasks active permanently for most non-boss content. This could have honestly said for boss content as well. With a lot of builds, once you get into the 6 and 7 charges, even bosses hit you enough to give you permanent flask uptime, given that the flask duration was recently increased. Solution: lower the value for these modifiers. And as you can see, delinquents and sinners are no longer rollable. You'll have 3 tiers: transgressors, masochists, and flagellants. So 1, 2, and 3 charges when hit by an enemy respectively. The existing items can of course be downgraded with a divine orb. This is always a warning to not divine your legacy items. A lot of people are saying, oh, now I'm going to have to hit my flasks again, which is at best a really bad take, and at worst, blatant misinformation. The reason you don't have to hit your flasks is because you automate them to use when full, use when frozen, use when you take a savage hit, use when the effect ends, all with instilling orbs. If you're using them when the effect ends, it's true that that loop might break now, and you'll have to hit them manually. Alternatively, you can just change the instilling enchantment to use when flasks are full and never worry about it again. In other words, this part isn't a big deal. There's no effective change to how often you have to hit your flasks manually. The only change is to the amount of time your flasks are up. And this change is actually very healthy for Path of Exile. Right now, there are effectively 2 flask prefixes in the game: gain charges when hit and increased effect. If you have a Mageblood, you use increased effect. If you're anybody else, you use gain charges when hit. But those aren't the only prefixes that appear on flasks. You can also roll for increased duration, or increased charge recovery, potentially even increased charge recovery reduced effect for builds that are especially slow. And in the case of certain flasks, having reduced charges used can be a very big boon. What I expect is going to happen from this is how people use flasks isn't going to change all that much. There's going to be a decline in the number of people who reuse flasks when the effect ends, and there's going to be an increase in people who use flasks when charges are full, when you're poisoned, when you take a savage hit, when you use an adjacent flask, any of those other effects that are perfectly effective for automating flasks. It's also going to mean that instead of just defaulting to, well, this is what you do and everything else is wrong, there's going to be a lot more choice here. You might want a flask that has extremely long duration, that lasts, let's just say 20 seconds. You won't need that many charges, and you'll have really good uptime. Alternatively, if you're using something like a basalt flask that tends to be a little bit charge greedy, flask charge recovery rate, or reduced charges used, maybe even increased charges held, are all going to be pretty good options now. Overall, this is a very good change to flasks. It'll require a little adjustment, and after you get through that initial rough period, I think it's going to feel a lot better than you're expecting, and a lot better than it did before. Now, in somewhat related news, I also wanted to talk very quickly about Sniper's Mark. The mana and life flask charge generation have now been removed from Sniper's Mark, but they're going to appear again in the future somewhere. And personally, this wasn't something that was super on my radar as an abusable thing. It was certainly there, and I believe some of the Mark Masteries, don't quote me on that, could also have some sort of synergy with that. I know if you're in that part of a tree, there are a lot of nodes that give either life or mana flask charges or effect. So you're already pretty well positioned if you're a ranger to use a lot of this stuff. If you're using it on, say, a witch, then you're a lot more poorly positioned, and hopefully what will come in is new items, maybe items from the League mechanic, since the hint is you may see these stats appear again in the future, that will make up for that. I understand why you don't want something that's incredibly good for damage and also incredibly good for sustain all lumped together. I also expect that there's going to be decent numbers of alternatives, such as using a Pantheon, such as maybe just using Recoup or using Mana Regeneration or using Mana Leech, where Sniper's Mark was the easy answer, and much like with Flasks, this is going to push for more build diversity. and more build diversity is something that I think we can all look forward to. Next up, I'm going to talk about Melding of a Flesh, which is one of the more impactful defensive changes to come out of a development manifesto. Before I do though, a quick reminder that if you found this video to be informative, or maybe you appreciate the fact that I'm providing information rather than just ranting and jumping on the clickbait Reddit salt train, well, be sure to give it a like, and show it to your friends so that they have a little hope for 3.19, because realistically, I don't think this development manifesto is the end of the world, and a lot of these changes aren't going to matter nearly as much as people think once we actually get the patch notes and once we actually get in-game and start playing. If you want to see more content, including Development Manifesto Part 3, where I talk about some of the defenses like spell suppression, get subscribed and ring that bell to be notified. If you want to see other types of content, including a video that's coming up on Multiverses, a really fun Smash-like game, get subscribed to my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts. Link will be down in the description and in the card right now. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members whose continued support allow me to make videos just like this one. More about how you can support at the end. Melding of a Flesh is an incredibly powerful unique jewel that means that your maximum elemental resistance is equal to your other maximum elemental resistances. If you want to know more, check the card as I did a whole video breaking down how melding works. It's a very powerful item, and as GGG says here, it outcompeted all other forms of elemental mitigation for well-itemized builds. Pretty much, if you were wearing good gear, you're probably putting melding in at some point or another. Personally, I expected to see the lure weave treatment here, where it would set all of your resistances to the highest, but have an innate penalty that says your maximum resistance cannot go beyond, let's just say 85%. What GGG did was, along those lines, a little bit less punishing actually. The jewel now rolls -4 to -6% to all maximum elemental resistances. So if you use Melding of a Flesh in a build that used it before, you either need 4% higher to the maximum resistance that you are boosting, or you'll be stuck at 86% down from 90. Because it's just a -4% instead of your maximum is 4% lower, or some similar wording, this is a penalty that you can overcome with gear. Think of it this way. Right now, if you're using 3% on your chest piece and then 2% on your gloves, that's +5. You're using Purity of Ice, that's another +5. You're using an Aegis, that's +5. You've now got 90. At this point, that would go down to 86. But if you have 80% increased effective auras on you, let's say you're using some introspection clusters, you've got a few nodes on the tree, all that good stuff, then you go right back up because you'd have 94% max cold res, which goes down to 90, and so you have 90% to all maximum elemental resistances again. This is a nerf. It's a nerf that requires more investment, and it also means that a good Melding of the Flesh, a -4% with 70% as the res penalty, will be worth quite a bit more than it used to be. It doesn't kill melding, it does make it a little bit harder to fit, and I think that's fair, especially since there are other ways to deal with elemental mitigation, which hopefully we'll see some more play as of 3.19. And finally, because it's come up quite a bit now, Omni got nerfed. But how bad is it? Well, the amount of penetration and resistances granted by Omni have now been lowered, which is to say the scaling was changed from 1% pen, 1% res per 10 Omni to 1% res, 1% pen per 15 Omni. This change will affect existing items, which means it is a nerf to standard builds. This makes sense because, as GGG says here, you can use Ashes of the Stars on a wide variety of builds, but if you use Omni on multiple builds, they all end up looking very similar. They're using a lot of the very similar kind of items that you'd see. Maybe a Black Sun crest for the helmet. Maybe something like Annihilating Light for the weapon, since you get triple damage and you don't have to worry about penetration anyway, so giving up a weapon that might roll penetration isn't that big of a deal. Giving up a weapon in general isn't that big of a deal. You don't need to scale gem levels when you get that much pen. It's also entirely possible that a lot of the high-end Omni builds will be relatively unaffected. You're able to get far more damage than you needed out of them, to the point where you could easily trivialize even the hardest content in Path of Exile. Low-end Omni builds will probably be hit here. That said, if Omni remains around 50 exalts like it did in 3.18, I don't think there were all that many builds that can't afford to stack enough Omni to make it effective at 15 that could at 10. If you're looking at 50 exalts for a single item, it's very likely that you're looking at 100 exalts for all the rest of your gear. Does this potentially make your gear more expensive? Yeah. At the same time, we don't know what crafting 3.19 is going to bring. We don't know what crafting 3.20 is going to bring. And I don't think it's a good thing to have all the Omni builds look exactly the same anyway. So now there's going to be a much finer balance between how much Omniscience you want to stack and other stats like attack speed, cast speed, and crit multiplier, which should render Omni in a much healthier place. And that finishes part 2 of the character balance in Path of Exile 3.19 TLDR. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to let me know down in the comments other topics you'd like to see. I plan to do at least 2 more TLDRs, one of which will focus on the defenses that I haven't already addressed, and the other of which will focus on minions. But I'm open to making more if that's something that a lot of people want to see, so let me know that down in the comments below, along with what you're most excited for about 3.19. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Your support helps keep me independent and allows me to turn down things like sketchy mobile game sponsorships. You can do so for as low as $1 a month over on Patreon, or if you want to support me completely for free, then you can join the community by hopping into my Discord, link below. If you want more content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts. It's a place that I use to review games, ramble my way through video essays, and a lot more. Or of course, you can just click the suggested video in the card right now. I hope you learned something today, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.